right, welcome everyone to the Matrix Conversations and Transformations, a webinar series from the Department of Critical Theory and Social Justice. I'm Mary Christianakis and I'm joined by my co-organizers of the series, Professor Malek Moazzam Dolat and Professor and Chair of the Department, Caroline Heldman. This event is also co-sponsored by the California Immigration Semester, and I'm joined by my colleague, Professor Richard Mora. First, a bit about the series. The series focuses on pressing current events and seeks to connect our community with experts, scholars, artists, and the most effective activists. This fall, we were running a series on all things immigration, and this is the last of that series. The Matrix will be taking a little break until the spring of 2021 semester, when we'll begin our third season. Be sure to check back with us in January as we take up a new set of themes to discuss our slate of our outstanding guests. You can keep up with the show, register for upcoming events, and access our YouTube channel where you can watch videos of past events at oxy.edu/matrix. We're also on Instagram and Twitter at CTSJ Oxy for both of those. Now, for today, I have the pleasure of introducing to you Professor María Rendon. Professor Rendon is a sociologist at UC Irvine who examines the integration process of Latino immigrants and their children in the United States. She pays close attention to the role of spatial inequality and examines how urban neighborhoods shape life trajectories, particularly educational attainment and social mobility. Today, she'll be discussing her book, Stagnant Dreamers, How the Inner City Shapes the Integration of Second-Generation Latinos. And this book has received several awards by the American Sociological Association, including the Robert E. Park Award, Distinguished Contribution to Research Book Award, honorable mention for the Thomas, and I don't even know how to say this, Znaniecki Best Book Award, and it was also a finalist for the Pierre Bourdieu Book Award in the Sociology of Education and an International Latino Book Award. Please welcome her to our webinar, and we look forward to hearing from you, Professor.
Thank you so much. Okay, well, thank you everyone for this invitation, and I'm very much eager to share some of the main findings of the book that I'm going to be highlighting today. So what I'm going to do is share my screen. I have a PowerPoint presentation for you guys to kind of help us guide the presentation here of the book. So, so this is a cover. Some of you guys may be familiar with some of the street and the layout. We were just discussing sort of where I took the shot. This is out in 4th Street, heading into downtown. And so I'm a scholar who studies immigrants and children of immigrants in Los Angeles. So I'm really excited because I've been giving the book talk in different places, East Coast, so on. But it's really nice to have an audience that is centered in Los Angeles, who's familiar with the context. And so I'm really excited about that. I want to give you a little bit of background as to what motivated this study. The study began a long time when I was a PhD student. So this stems from the dissertation. And at that time, there was growing concern among academic scholars as to what was happening to children of immigrants, many of whom were growing up in American urban neighborhoods. Now, those of you who are familiar with the sociological literature know that the urban scholarship is primarily, urban sociology has for the past 20, 30 years centered primarily East Coast, Midwest cities, and has highlighted greatly the experience of African Americans. And this is for good reason, of course, given the levels of segregation and poverty concentration in these communities. But in the 80s and the 90s, we know that we had significant demographic shifts, particularly in places like Los Angeles, where we began to see a rise in the immigrant population, and many of these urban cities transformed as they became increasingly Latinos. And really, there is still a dearth of research, limited research, theoretical work that really tries to understand what that experience has been in the American cities for Latinos. Most of our urban sociological theories, again, stem from the experience of African Americans. On the other end, we have a body of literature on immigration that when I was doing the dissertation was also getting a lot of attention, specifically the focus again on the second generation, what was happening to children of immigrants in these neighborhoods. And so, you know, these two bodies of literature, urban sociology and immigration, tend not to be in conversation with each other. And so my book tries to bring these bodies of literature together. Again, historically, the theoretical work on immigration centers on this experience of asking questions on integration and with a heavy emphasis on the assimilation process, acculturation processes. And that body of literature has historically focused primarily on the experience of European immigrants that settled in these cities. So if there's any intersection about, you know, immigrants and the inner city or central cities, it was historically centered on the experience of European immigrants in the East Coast, Midwest, and so on. So, you know, this leaves a big gap in the literature as far as what has been the experience of Latinos, Latino immigrants, and their children in contemporary American urban cities. And so, as you see here with my quote, immigrants stemming from Latin America come typically with limited human capital, right? There are workers who end up integrating into the labor market in the lower kind of, you know, very arduous labor, you know, poorly paid. And for them, when it comes to their measure of success and how they can measure their sense of whether or not they obtained the American dream, they look towards the accomplishments of their children, how their children are faring. For them, it's a very good indicator of how much progress they have made in this country. So the book centers on the immigrant experience in Los Angeles and the second generation. And again, I give a lot of attention to neighborhoods. I'm interested in neighborhood processes, how the urban context shapes both the acculturation and structural assimilation of immigrants and their children. And here I'm really talking about how is it that growing up in a particular context, urban neighborhood context, shape your life outcomes. We know that growing up in certain neighborhoods has implications for how far in school you get, how much earnings you have, and even as we now know, right, with the COVID pandemic, your health outcomes, right? So we know that these contextual factors exist above and beyond your individual level factors. Context matters. It has an impacts your overall well-being. And so this study, while tries to unpack as, you know, why that is. Why is it that growing up in certain types of neighborhoods is related or associated with poor life outcomes later on? And that statistical relationship has been found repeatedly in a number of studies. What this book does through the qualitative research that I engage in is to try to unpack those neighborhood mechanisms, right? What is it about these neighborhoods that perhaps complicates the ability for Latino immigrants and their children to more successfully integrate into American society? And by successfully here, again, I'm talking about measures of educational mobility, social mobility, as we think about in terms of where they end up, in what kinds of jobs, how much they earn over the life course, right? So I focus primarily on young men. People always ask me why young men and young women, and this had to do with the fact that I was going to immerse myself in two neighborhood contexts in Los Angeles and study these two contexts, and I'll explain why in a bit. We know that young men have a distinct relationship to urban environments. And the concern among scholars, particularly immigration scholars who were voicing concern about the second generation, very often pointed to issues of criminalization or incarceration among the Latino young men that we began to see at higher rates. And of course, their lower levels of educational attainment relative to their female Latina co-ethnics, for example. So we knew that young men were having a distinct relationship to the neighborhood matters, and they navigate these spaces in different ways than young women do. Now, what you guys are seeing here, it's a very provocative picture on the top right. The concept, immigration scholars in the early 1990s were looking at American cities that were experiencing high levels of violence, and at that time, you know, high levels of indicators of social disorder, and these sorts of things, and were suggesting that children of immigrants growing up in those environments would experience what they called downward assimilation. And what downward assimilation suggested was that not only were these young men going to experience limited mobility, maybe struggle in school, but they were actually going to detach from the labor market. So whereas immigrants come in and they have a strong attachment to the labor market, they were concerned, these scholars were concerned that in the inner city, many of these young men were actually going to not just struggle economically, but perhaps to even worse by becoming entangled with crime and violence and these sorts of things, right? Now, of course, this was an open question because at the time in the 90s when this segmented assimilation and this concept of downward assimilation was proposed, most of the second generation were actually young, very young. And so what I do in my study is that I focus on young adults. The young men that I studied, and so I'll give you an introduction to this, were in their late teens, early 20s when I began to study them, and then I studied them into their mid 20s. So the segmented assimilation theory that immigration scholars were suggesting, that were proposing, and this concept of downward assimilation made claims that it was in urban neighborhoods of concentrated poverty where there was exposure to racial and ethnic minorities. Here we got to think about poor African Americans, poor Chicanos, okay, in these inner cities, that by being exposed to this, these racial minorities that presumably had an oppositional culture, okay, that was the argument, that the new wave of children of immigrants settling in the cities would then adopt a negative acculturation processes and would head down this path of crime and detachment from work and school and so on. So very purposefully, I studied two neighborhoods in Los Angeles that were very similar as far as their poverty rate. They are among the most poverty concentrated communities still today in Los Angeles. Some of you might guess, I have the East LA, South LA area, two pockets in those regions in the city, one Mexican immigrant, one heavily Latino and Black. Okay, and the idea was to see, are there any differences through exposure to the racial and ethnic minorities here? And so I was very careful to choose these two neighborhoods, making sure that I identified the right context where there was most concern. And then I identified 42 young men, children of immigrants, again, in their late to early 20s in 2007. I conducted a year-long field study there with these young men. I got to know them very well. I met with them multiple times that year. I met with their parents. And one of the things that I made sure was that I did not focus only on young men that were, for example, involved in gangs and violence. We knew one of my concerns was that the urban scholarship literature was heavily tilted in that direction. We had a number of wonderful studies on those processes, but yet we were forgetting the majority of young men from these same neighborhoods that did not join gangs, that actually did complete high school, and who had, many of them who had started going to college, right? And so I wanted to make sure that I identified a range of young men that varied in their educational attainment. So a third were college going, a third were high school, what I call my high school non-completers, and a third were these young men in between. And again, I interviewed the immigrant parents to really understand that immigrant context in the lives of these young men. And it began as, so once I graduated and I got the job, I began to write the book, but we were coming out of the Great Recession. And it was really hard to write a book on the social mobility experience of these young men without accounting for the Great Recession. So I actually decided to go back to the field to do follow-up studies with half of the young men and their parents. And by this, these young men were mid to late 20s by the time I ended up collecting the data. And at that time, I could have gone and collected more data, and part of the reason why I didn't, it just had to do with constraints, teaching, mother of 2 young kids, this sort of stuff. And so, but I had really good response from the study participants. And so what I'm going to present to you is what I found over the course of these 2 waves. The very first thing, of course, that comes up, and that was very evident even when I was doing my observations there in these neighborhoods, was the salience of violence in the lives of these young men. Now, many of you are familiar that we peaked, urban violence peaked across the country, including in Los Angeles in the mid 1990s. And since then, we've seen a decline in violence, but violence still concentrates in our poorest neighborhoods. And it's still an issue in many of these communities. And so the young men that I studied talked about this, and it was not just the young men, but the immigrant parents had a lot to say about their experience arriving to Los Angeles in the late 70s. Most of them were coming in the late 70s, most of them in the 80s, and a few in the early 1990s. So the immigrants that I studied settled in Los Angeles during the peak of urban violence. This was a time when Los Angeles, was named gang capital of the world. This is a time where gang, drive-by shootings were very common in the city, every weekend and so on. And so the very first introduction to American society for these immigrants was through these neighborhoods that were wrestling with these issues of gang violence. In the book, I talk about how immigrants responded to that, initially retreating, right, to the violence. And I dedicate 2 chapters of the book to talking about how the young men and the immigrants then adapted and responded to the violence. And one of the arguments that I make in the book is that the young men who were most exposed to violence in these neighborhoods were those that ended up entangling themselves in getting caught up, getting caught up and entangling themselves in peer ties, sometimes gang ties, even though they themselves may not have been in gangs, crew ties, where there was a lot of self-protection. And so as a way to navigate these urban environments, many of them drew on these ties for protection. But in the process, these acts of reciprocity, protecting one another, ended up becoming sources of, ended up getting schools' attention, right? And we know that in these communities, there's very heavy punitive measures against young people. And so we began to see that the young men who were most exposed to violence began to get entangled with local conflicts. Schools pushed back heavily against this. And with schools pushing heavily against this, we see links to, of course, probation officers, police. This is, again, a time when we began to see a rise in policing in these neighborhoods, including in the schools. So one of the stories here is that violence was the most salient feature of the neighborhood from the perspective of immigrant parents and from the perspective of young men themselves. And they talked extensively about this and the implications for this. And the young men who were most vulnerable were those who were most exposed to the violence there. And so the parents, it was not just the academic scholars who were concerned about the well-being of the young men. It was also the parents who were concerned about the future, the safety, of course, of their sons, and then the future prospects of their sons. And so one of the things that I point out is the way in which parents then responded to the environment as a way to protect their children. So the reality is that things were pretty challenging on the ground in these neighborhoods when these immigrants settled and when they were trying to raise their sons in these environments. And there were true risks for the well-being and safety of the children, and that had very important implications for the education and overall later on criminalization of these young men. And of course, the concern here was whether or not these young men, or a bulk of them, would experience chronic poverty over time. That was the projection, or really follow into this path of downward assimilation. And what I point out in the book was that there was actually, I found very little evidence for this, very few cases, although I'll highlight some of the more vulnerable cases as well. The majority of young men in these neighborhoods, despite the violence, despite these difficult, challenging conditions that they experienced, ended up reproducing, late in their 20s, right? Their working class and working poor kind of background. They were more likely to fall into the camp. And there's both a positive story here and a negative, right? On the one hand, it's good to hear that most of these young men that we were primarily concerned with, maybe the guys who did not complete high school, who had gotten entangled with law enforcement or had been criminalized, that many of them did not fall into the downward assimilation category. And that's a good thing, and I'll explain as to why that is. On the other hand, many of the young men who we would have hoped, right, to have experienced more social mobility because they had gone on to college, were actually having a really hard time accomplishing that. So let's start first why we didn't see this negative acculturation process and this downward assimilation. Of course, these are cultural arguments about the urban neighborhoods, right? And the way that cultural context sort of sways the second generation in a particular way. But one of the things that I point out in the book is that these neighborhoods are culturally and morally contested spaces and communities, right? Immigrants arrived to this context and initially retreated, right? There's a lot of discussion about how they were scared initially in that environment. But eventually, immigrants built ties with one another and began to make claims on these neighborhoods. And the claims that they began to make on these neighborhoods is that these were working poor communities, working class communities, and they began to alter the social and cultural context of the urban neighborhoods, right? So there was a lot of discussion among the immigrant community that highlighted work as a moral order, talking about how everybody works in these communities, how buses are always full of Latino workers heading out very early on. And this was described as a cultural feature of the community, a feature that actually was used to push against some of the connotations and sort of depictions of the urban environment as being violent, as being a place of social disorder. So immigrants talked a lot about these moral boundaries. There was moral boundaries. On the one hand, you had the undocumented immigrants that were always referenced as hardworking individuals who kind of carried a moral worth, despite that, we know that undocumented immigrants in these communities earn very minimally, or are the most exploited in Los Angeles. There was a sense of moral worth to their hard work ethic, right? And these individuals were always sort of referenced against, right, the gang youth, the Americanized gang youth in these environments. So when we look at the way the cultural context of these neighborhoods, these were morally contested and culturally contested spaces. And the second generation navigates, right, and is attuned to these claims that are made about the community and about these neighborhoods, and had to navigate sort of that cultural context. And it turned out that many of them aligned themselves with the immigrant community because, again, the immigrant community was associated with a hard work ethic, and therefore there was moral worth. So even if you are a young man who's not earning a whole lot, you still have that to look towards as a way to kind of give your a sense of dignity in these communities. So one was the cultural context being much more complicated than the sociologists initially had suggested. Another thing was the kin and community ties that developed in these communities over time. Again, initially there was, there was concern about building relationships. Building relationships in violent environments is not easy to do, but over time, immigrants sort of connected to one another. Now, one of the things that I point out in the book is that when it comes to Mexican immigrants, and the book primarily focuses on Mexican immigrants, is that, this is a community that has had 100 years of migration to Los Angeles, right? And of course, there's people of Mexican descent here prior to it being the US. And so, the connections and the networks are really well established. So in most cases, the immigrants that arrived to Los Angeles, the immigrants that I studied, could look towards kin, a sister, a brother, a father, a cousin, someone, or a lot of people actually, often, from their communities that they could tap into, that they could access as a means of social support, right? And eventually over time, you began to see that develop also in the neighborhoods, right? So young men, mothers like Jesusita talked about how eventually they connected with one another in the neighborhood. They protected and looked out for one another. And these social ties, those of you who are familiar with the concept of collective efficacy, right? The collective efficacy concept suggests that tight bonds in a community lowers violence and social disorder, right? People look out for one another. And this is in fact what many of these immigrants were suggesting happened over time in these neighborhoods. And it began initially through kin ties and then extended to the broader community. Now, one of the things that I do point out is that not all immigrants, Mexican immigrants in this case, arrive with kin or are able to build kin and community ties over time. And so we tend not to talk about these immigrants or these families. It's kind of even hard to imagine perhaps that in a place like Los Angeles with such a large Mexican community that we would find Mexican immigrant families who would be socially isolated, meaning not connected to kin, not connected to community or institutions. And it was these immigrant families that I found had a much difficult experience in these neighborhoods and whose sons ended up being much more exposed to the urban environment, to urban violence, and then experiencing all the negative repercussions of that. So we can go back to this in a bit, but it was something that I had not thought about and that it emerged in the study. Now, kin and community ties, the academic literature and sociology at least had suggested that the Mexican community lacked social capital. And the reason why is because when we think about social capital in ethnic immigrant communities, we think about communities like the Chinatowns, maybe Cubans in Florida. These are communities that not only there are extensive ethnic ties, but there are also cross-class ties. There is a sizable middle class, entrepreneur class, let's say, in the community. And studies show that when ethnic communities, when cross-class ethnic ties exist in an ethnic communities or an ethnic enclave, that can be very beneficial for lower skilled immigrants arriving there. There's some other debates that we can talk about as to that, but the idea here was that the Mexican community did not have that kind of social capital because by and large, the Mexican community is a community of primarily working class individuals. So, so the literature had depicted the Mexican community as lacking social capital. And this is one of the things that I challenge in the book because I talk about how the kin and community ties that were developed in these neighborhoods actually turned out to be great assets for young men in these very specific environments. again, we got to keep in mind not only the larger neighborhood context, but the fact that these young men were attending urban schools, many of them wrestling to, struggling to get youth out and graduate from high school. And of course, who we know struggle to provide adequate or high quality education for our students for a whole host of reasons. And so many young men were like Noel, who was, graduated from high school, was not interested in going to college, and who suggested that he learned more with his dad than he did at work. He worked on construction side, project with his father, with his uncles. That link to the kin ties removed him from the neighborhood, limited his exposure to the violence, and later on ended up being his source of access to a job. One of the things that I found for the second generation was that many of them were relying heavily on brothers and uncles and mothers and undocumented father-in-laws and to access jobs and to find jobs. And this is something that we have not given so much attention to. How is it that the second generation finds jobs when they're transitioning into the labor market? And the young men that I studied were that very similar to immigrants who tap into their networks. The second generation was doing the same. They were tapping into their existing networks, which most of them tended to tap into their immigrant and kin and community network. So young men like Ephraim, who was not able to complete his, earn his high school diploma, was able to find numerous jobs, even though he did not have a diploma. He struggled, he didn't earn a whole lot, even when I followed up with him and he was in his late 20s, but he had never experienced bouts of unemployment, extended bouts of unemployment, because there is always someone he could go to who could link him to a job. And kin became incredibly important. So kin and community ties inhibited downward assimilation by protecting the young men in these neighborhoods from limiting their exposure to the neighborhood and the violence, and at the same time being sources of access to jobs, right? And so this was really important. So the story, the idea that most of these young men like Noel and Ephraim would detach from the labor market was simply just not, I did not come across that in the interviews that I conducted. So kin and community ties, I describe as an asset and as a type of social capital, right? I talk about this primarily as a source of social support that inhibited downward assimilation in these communities. So, so violence was the most, clear aspect, perhaps most evident, most obvious, rather, aspect of the neighborhood that ended up being detrimental for some of these young men. But there was something else, right? Because when I was following up with these young men, and it turned out, well, a good number of them actually were buffered from the neighborhood and from the violence through these kin and community ties. A good number of them were being linked to jobs through kin and community ties. And it turned out that many of these young men were actually graduating from high school, right? And trying to pursue higher education, usually through the community college route. Although I also had young men in Cal State's private colleges and so on. And one of the things that in the follow-up study that became very clear is that regardless of the educational outcome, the young men were looking very similar to one another as far as how much they were earning in their mid to late 20s. Most of them were earning about $15 an hour on average, give and take, and that fell in line with the median income in their neighborhood. So in many sense, in an important way, I was not seeing much shift, right? For the group of young men that I was studying, they were falling pretty much in line with folks in their neighborhoods. And again, the second generation relied heavily on kin and community ties to navigate the labor market. And what I found was that this was not just the case for young men like Ephraim and Noel, who I highlighted right now, who were high school graduates and a non-high school graduate, but it was also evident among the college graduates. And so this, led me to look at these cases a little bit more carefully. to try to understand why the young men, the inner city young men from these neighborhoods were having a hard time, who had gone on to college, who had sort of skirted the violence, who were on their way in a promising direction, right, through higher education, why they were struggling in their mid to late 20s, and looking very similar to the young men who had stayed behind in their neighborhood. And so what I talk about is the long reach of segregation, right? The long reach of segregation. We know that, that the social networks of immigrants are very closed. We know that immigrants rely heavily on immigrant networks to navigate the labor market. Well, it turns out that the second generation is also, that I found in Los Angeles with these young men, also had very insular social networks, very closely tied to community and ethnic ties. And as I point out, on the one hand, that's a good thing. On the other hand, that becomes problematic when we think about extending outside of these working class jobs and trying to gain entry into jobs that we tend to associate with a college degree, better paid, and so on. I had young men like, excuse me, Manuel, who actually was my only Ivy Leaguer. He was out on the East Coast. And when I first met him, he had graduated, and it had been 2 years since he had graduated, and he was unemployed. When I followed up with him again, when he was 27, he was earning $12 an hour. He had worked in nonprofits as a tutor in Target, in the garment district, as a college grad from an Ivy League, even as a gardener, during the time that I studied, during the time of the study. And he talked about that experience. Now, Manuel was, left his urban neighborhood, his urban high school, ended up in a very privileged environment. And those of you who are familiar with the literature on higher education and Latinos and first-generation college students, particularly those who come from these environments, know that many of these young men struggle academically, initially, at least at times. And that was the case for Manuel. He ended up switching from an engineering major to a Spanish literature major. This was still challenging, but he was able to accomplish and earn his degree. He was very proud of his accomplishment. And he spent so much time and energy making sure that he graduated, right? That he missed the opportunity while he was in this institution to expand his networks in meaningful ways that might then help him in the labor market later on, right? And so Manuel ended up coming back to the urban neighborhood and started looking for work using the same networks in a very similar ways as the guys back in the neighborhood were looking for work, right? He would go online. At times he resorted to kin and community ties, and sometimes even to these work agencies. And that's how he ended up being a gardener at some point. And as you see here in my quotes, he talked about that experience and how he couldn't believe that he was there, as much as he, recognized that there was nothing wrong with this kind of work. But he figured that after having received a BA from an Ivy League, that he figured that this was not where he was supposed to be, right? And so young men like Manuel, probably my most extreme case, but many other young men who had gone to college were having a hard time navigating these institutions of higher education on their own, and then also then making that transition into the labor market with their degrees, relying heavily on kin and community ties. When we look at the young men that we could say were successful in the sense that they were earning, something in line with their degree, were entering the middle class, it had a more promising path into the middle class. A couple of them were homeowners, which is really hard to do in Los Angeles, certainly in your late 20s. These young men, when you look at that, when I looked closely at these cases, what distinguished these young men was not the degree, was not something about them that was, I don't know, they were more motivated than the others. What was different was that they had an opportunity to expand their networks while they were navigating these institutions of higher education. And so most of them had gotten their job through someone who had opened doors, right? And so I talk about this in the book as social leverage ties or palancas, which is the way Osvaldo referred to this, right? And these are basically individuals who exist outside of the urban context, outside of kin and community ties, and that who have access to mainstream society, who recommend you, who open doors, right? And so the young men who were most successful in that regard, who experienced some social mobility and were on a more promising path to a more middle class livelihood, were young men who could turn to and talk about these individuals, college professors, a staff person who recommended them, someone who opened a door. And so I talk about the fact that inner city young men, even those who then end up going into institutions of higher education, have a difficult time accessing these networks. Stanton Salazar, who's put together a really interesting book years back, talked about these individuals as institutional agents, right? Institutional agents who empower these young people and who create these opportunities for social mobility. On the other end, we had young men who were the most marginalized in these neighborhoods. These were the young men who had been most exposed, who came from the families that were least connected to community and kin ties, and who were most exposed to the neighborhood. They were the young men who were most entrenched in the neighborhood context, who had experienced criminalization in these neighborhoods, and who were very much attuned to the moral context of the neighborhood, right? So they were very quick to blame themselves. I call them self-blamers for their situation, right? Young men like Valentin, who was an ex-gang member, had not been in a gang for a couple of years when I met him, and who was unemployed and on general relief, who was sort of staying on the couch of a friend, talked about how, you know, the police being on his back all the time was really his fault because of the decisions he made, right? He was very quick to say, you know, in this community, there's hardworking people. I'm not one of them. And there was a lot of self-blame that took place. A lot of these young men talked about their situation in that way. One of the things that and these are my last 2 points, one of the things that I highlight in the book is that the urban environment, there's a paradox in the urban environment, right? On the one hand, we know that urban conditions constrain the social mobility prospects of young people. At the same time, these are places where there's a strong adherence to the American dream concept, to this idea of meritocracy and individualism. So young men, most of the young men in my study, I described as optimistic, resolute, optimistic young men who, despite confronting racial and ethnic barriers and class structural barriers, sort of dismissed these things and suggested that there really was no barrier for them, that there was nothing holding them back, that all you had to do was work hard to get ahead. And if you did that, you're going to end up being where you want to be, that it was just a matter of your effort and strive. So, you know, young men like David, who was also struggling in the labor market, emphasized that the American dream is in your mind. If you push yourself, you can get there. The only thing that is stopping you is yourself. So this kind of thinking was very prominent among the young men across educational levels. So this included the young men who were in college, who then were struggling there, and who were somewhat resistant at times to seek out support, in part because they felt that they needed to get through this on their own. I think there's some issues of masculinity here that I think we can talk about in the discussion. But young men like Fernando, who was not able to complete his college degree. He was off by a few classes, and he was not allowed back into the university. He got sort of terminated. Suggested when I asked him why he had not sought help when he was struggling, he said, well, isn't that what you're supposed to do? You're supposed to be on your own. So in these young men who are coming from these urban neighborhoods, tended to emphasize a sense of individualism and meritocracy. And what that suggests, of course, is that if you work hard, you can get ahead. And if you don't get ahead, it's a reflection of perhaps not working hard or making mistakes, as a young man that I highlighted. So the last thing here is that while that was the case for most of these young men who remained very much entrenched in their neighborhoods, it was those who ended up stepping out of the neighborhood, who began to question and who began to recognize racial and class barriers and began to develop race and class consciousness. So Manuel, who had gone now to the Ivy League, did not reference undocumented population, reference instead middle-class whites who he could see had different opportunities from him. And he was more able to talk about race as mattering in his ability to navigate the labor market and class as well. So I'll stop there, and then we can open it up for discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Rendon. So we have a Q&A feature. So if folks want to ask questions, they can ask questions on the Q&A. In the meantime, we'll start off with questions from the other panelists here, the other folks. So I'll start off with one. I'm really fascinated by your idea of sort of social network, right, and the ties and folks standing beyond themselves, and having, it seems like there were moments where it was maybe a particular individual or individuals. How much of that was mentorship, and how much of that was just simply information, the passing along of information?
Yeah, so the folks who ended up with these leverage ties, you know, I think it was a mix, right? And in some cases, young people talked about meaningful relationships they established, say with a professor or someone along the way who pointed them, who said, call this person, they'll interview you, and the job's yours if you call. And this was in a vocational school or in a college, university campus. Sometimes it was that kind of, but sometimes it was actually, hey, I happen to know you, we have a relationship, I'm gonna pass on this information, right? And so it was a little bit mixed, you know. I think that the challenge here, what I pointed out is, you know, there was among the young men, you know, when many of them, the ones who had graduated from high school, looked back, you know, they recognized how hard it was. And again, these were young men who graduated during the Great Recession, right? And so they had a particularly difficult time finding work. They look back and they, you know, I wish someone had told me that I needed to build these relationships when I was there, that these internships really mattered a great deal, that, you know, and so I think at times some of them may have heard this information, but some of them were so busy trying to get through the classes, right? Trying to graduate, that I think they missed these opportunities, right? I don't think the institutions were doing anything in particular to reach out to them, right? It was sort of like, if I happen to bump into this lady who was at the library and she happened to, right? And then they sparked a relationship, and then that ended up being fruitful. So oftentimes, in some cases, it was somewhat happenstance, right? And so for me, what it means is that institutions of higher education need to be more thoughtful about this process. When we're thinking about our first generation college students, right? How do we facilitate that process? You know, what can we do to make that process of networking and building relationships and connecting them to resources, information, something more proactive, not something that's there, right? Because we know that we have these resources in these institutions, they're there, They're there in the background, but we need to make that direct connection, I think, for these young people.
So it sounds like it's very much, for some of these young folks, it was very much the strength of weak ties, right? Sort of Mark Granovetter's ideas of strength of weak ties.
Right.
Benefiting from someone who's outside of their network.
That's right.
And have information that they couldn't acquire otherwise.
That's right, because they're strong ties, right? They're kin and community ties. They reproduce the same information, right? It's like the same job at Costco or the same job at Home Depot, right? Those are the jobs that the community knows about and has, but we don't know about the jobs that exist outside of that, right? And so, so it takes these individuals who to broker that information and the broader kind of wider labor market. And usually the young men who were, who had a more promising kind of path had someone to do that, to help them and broker that relationship and open the opportunities for them that way.
Mm-hmm. If I, so when you were talking about meritocracy and the American dream, it reminded me of Ain't No Making It.
Mm-hmm. I keep going back to that book.
Yeah. Right. It sort of reminded me of that that notion of how it is that you can end up blaming yourself.
Right.
Right. When there's maybe part of what you're dealing with are structural forces and forces beyond your control that limit your opportunities, but you so believe in the American dream and the idea of individualism that you come to hold yourself responsible for your trajectory. Right. It's interesting because having volunteered like at a juvenile detention facility, Professor Krishnakis did so as well. We would often hear those narratives from the young people there, right? That sort of the failure, whatever failures they might have had, whatever failures they perceived in their life, they often attributed to choices they made, and it's just solely on them.
Right.
Right. So what does that tell us about how do I, let me see, let me rephrase this. What does that tell us about the these notions of a downward assimilation, right? And that argumentation and how problematic that kind of framing might be.
Yeah, so I mean, there's the framing is problematic in a couple of ways, right? The downward assimilation concept assumes this negative acculturation process in the inner city, right? And so I try to challenge that through saying with actually these are much more culturally complicated places, right? There's push and pull, and people have conventional values and norms, and right, and so there's always this constant, and the young people are attuned to that, right? And so they got to figure out, well, which way do I go, right? How do I make my choices? How do I align myself in the community? And so I think it's problematic in the sense to characterize urban neighborhoods in a very culturally homogeneous way, right? So that's one problematic there. But I think, it misses, I think, also this impact of these dominant ideologies in American society that filter into our neighborhoods, right? So we're part of American society and American culture just as much as suburban neighborhoods and so on. And so I think, we need to question, where are our young people picking up these ideologies, right? I think we want to believe we're a meritocratic society, right? I think we, in part of the immigrant narrative that we try to tell ourselves that we're an immigrant community, a country of immigrants that work hard and pull themselves up by the bootstrap, right? I think we tend to cherish that narrative quite a lot, and we celebrate it in American society, right? And what that does so is that it eliminates, right, any real consideration about, structural barriers that immigrants of different types, right, might face, and their children in this case, right? And so I think, so to suggest that somehow the ideological cultural context of the neighborhoods is sort of widely removed from the rest of society, I think is a problem, right? And so I think that's, and so then we have to then think about, well, what, when we think about meritocracy, for the young men in my study who had supportive kin, who were connected to community ties and had support systems, upholding that meritocratic ideology was not so problematic, right? It kept them moving. They hit a wall, but they had the support structure, right? An uncle who stepped in and offered them a job, maybe an educator who helped them open a door. And so it was not problematic for these young people, right? In many ways, it kept them going, right? In some ways, that ideology, that idea that, if they work hard, they can get past whatever barriers are confronting at that time or adversities. But it became very problematic for the young people who did not have the support structures, right? The folks who were really on their own. The only thing they had was this ideology. And and this ideology then really forces them to only blame themselves, right? Because, and so this is what I think is one of the contributions in the book, by being able to look at young men from the same urban environment, but who had different social support structures, right? We tend to characterize these communities in like everybody's the same, right? But it became very clear when I began to hear the immigrant narratives, when I began to hear that these young people had varying levels of social support. And in the community, we have young people that are just much more vulnerable than other young people, right, in these communities. And that has in part to do with, the story of migration, the networks in the kin, in the family, the links to the community, right? And we began to see that there are young people in these neighborhoods who do, who are kind of on their own, right? On their own, exposed to the violence if there were young people, on their own later on in the labor market, right? And so, and these are the young people that, instead of blaming, which is usually what we think, right? That these young people, or at least the academic scholarship would suggest, and this is probably older work, that would suggest that they would blame race and class and, all these sorts of things, right? Structural barriers. These young people actually don't do that typically. They blame themselves, as you pointed out.
Well, Professor Rendon, thank you so much for joining us and for sharing.
Thank you so much.
I look forward to, I imagine that there might be some follow-up now that we've hit another economic crisis, right? And to see maybe how these
everybody's asking me to go back and see how they're doing. I might.
So thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Closing off our series.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Bye, everyone.
Take care.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.